Have you ever wondered what it would be like to have your entire life changed in an instant? What if one single decision, one bold action, could shift the course of everything? Imagine a young boy, no older than 10, who is stuck in a life he feels he can never escape. The daily grind, the uncertainty, the constant fear of not making it through another month. His world feels like it's closing in. But then, in the most unexpected moment, he stumbles upon something that could change his future forever. What if he had ignored the signs? What if he hadn't taken that leap of faith? Could the outcome have been different? Would he have continued living in the shadows, struggling to survive? And what about the man in the sharp suit? Who was he really? Was he the key to unlocking a new life? Or was he part of something much darker? Stay with us, because this is a story about courage, about fighting against the odds, and about discovering that sometimes the most dangerous risks lead to the greatest rewards. But the real question is, can one person truly change everything? But before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. Is it sunny or snowing where you are? If it's cold, make sure to bundle up, grab a cup of hot drink, and enjoy today's story with your loved ones. Stay healthy in the winter. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories to come. Ethan had always felt like life was slipping through his fingers, as if he were stuck in a cycle he couldn't escape. Every morning, he trudged to his job at the small, nearly forgotten airport on the outskirts of town, where the world seemed to pass him by. His job wasn't glamorous. He helped unload baggage, ran errands for the staff, and did his best to stay out of the way. The work was grueling, but it paid just enough to get by. Most days, Ethan didn't mind the solitude. After all, it was better than being stuck at home, watching his mom struggle to make ends meet. Ethan's life was simple, too simple, in fact. His clothes were worn, his shoes ragged, and his body lanky and awkward, with the awkwardness of a young man who had yet to grow into himself. The sun always felt too hot on the tarmac, and the dust that swirled in the air clung to him like an invisible weight. His world was small, just this airport and his small apartment with his mom. He would glance at the wealthy passengers arriving and leaving in their private jets and think for a moment how different their lives must be. The thought lingered for a while, but he would quickly shake it off. There was no point in dreaming about a life that wasn't meant for people like him. Ethan stood at the edge of the runway, staring out at the jets lined up in neat rows like silent sentinels waiting for their next flight. His shift was almost over, and he felt the weight of exhaustion settling in. His legs sore from hours of hauling bags and his fingers raw from the constant scrubbing. But as he looked toward the far side of the tarmac, something caught his eye. A man in dark clothes was crouched next to one of the private jets, his movements quick and deliberate. Ethan squinted against the harsh afternoon sun, trying to make out the details. The man's outfit, dark, almost black, seemed too out of place, too deliberate for someone just going about the usual business of the airport. He was fiddling with something near the landing gear, his hands moving with unnerving confidence as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Ethan's heart began to beat a little faster. His instincts told him something was wrong. His mind raced with the possibilities. Could the plane be in danger? Was this man trying to sabotage it? It was impossible to know for sure from this distance, but the feeling in his gut told him to act, to find out before it was too late. He watched for another moment, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The man seemed to be checking something near the underbelly of the jet, his hands moving quickly, almost frantically. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. The landing gear. Something wasn't right. Was he tampering with it? Was this man planning to cause something to happen during the flight? Ethan couldn't be sure, but the fear crawling up his spine told him that this wasn't an accident. The man's actions grew more urgent, and a cold sweat began to form on Ethan's brow. He knew he couldn't wait around any longer. Without thinking, his legs were already moving, carrying him forward toward the jet. His breath quickened as he pushed his way through the dusty ground, his heart hammering in his chest. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the situation was pressing down on him. He had no idea what he was walking into, but he knew he couldn't just stand by and let something terrible happen. He was nearly halfway across the tarmac when he saw it. The man looked up, glancing around as if to make sure no one was watching. His eyes met Ethan's, and for a split second, their gazes locked. Ethan's stomach dropped. The man's face was unreadable, but there was something cold in his eyes, something calculating. Ethan's pulse raced as he broke into a run. He had to stop him. If this man was sabotaging the jet, if there was a chance of something going wrong, he had to get to him before it was too late. He couldn't let it go. He couldn't live with himself if something happened, and he didn't do anything about it. As he drew closer, he could hear the sound of his own breath, ragged and uneven, mixing with the distant hum of the airport. He wasn't sure what he expected. Maybe a quick confrontation, maybe a chance to warn the man before things got out of hand. But just as he was about to shout out, something stopped him. He saw a group of people approaching from the hangar. They were dressed in suits, their faces serious and intent as they walked toward the jet. Among them was a man who stood out, tall, confident, with an air of authority that made Ethan's throat tighten. It was the same man he had seen earlier, the one who seemed out of place at the airport, the one he had assumed might be the owner of the jet. Ethan's eyes darted between the two figures, the mysterious man near the landing gear and the businessman approaching with his entourage. This was it. The man in the suit was going to board the plane. He had to warn him. If he didn't, who would? But Ethan was too far away, and the security guards were already making their way toward him. He could see them now, their eyes narrowing as they noticed him heading toward the jet. They didn't know who he was, didn't understand the danger he was trying to stop. And that fear in his gut, the one telling him something was terribly wrong, only grew stronger. "Hey, you!" one of the guards shouted. His voice was sharp, commanding, and Ethan felt a jolt of panic surge through him. He didn't stop. He couldn't. Every second counted. He had to get to the man in the suit. Ethan pushed through the growing crowd, weaving between people as he broke into a sprint, his feet pounding against the tarmac. He could hear the guard's heavy footsteps behind him, growing louder and closer, but he didn't dare look back. The man in the suit was getting closer to the plane, and there was no time to waste. "Stop! Don't get on that plane!" Ethan shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He could feel his heart racing, the words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed plea. "It's been sabotaged. The plane isn't safe. Please, don't get on." His words were barely out of his mouth before the guards were on him. Strong hands grabbed his arms, pulling him back, stopping him in his tracks. Ethan struggled, trying to break free, his mind racing. He could see the confusion in the businessman's face as he turned toward them, eyebrows furrowed, but the guards were too quick. They pulled him away, their grip unrelenting, and Ethan's voice fell silent as they dragged him to the side. "You don't understand," Ethan gasped, kicking out with his feet, trying to shake free. "I'm trying to save you. It's dangerous. The plane." But the guards weren't listening. They weren't letting go. The businessman watched from a distance, still standing by the jet, clearly puzzled, but not quite understanding the gravity of the situation. Ethan's last-ditch effort to warn him had failed, and now, as the guards hauled him away, all he could do was watch helplessly as the man in the suit made his way toward the aircraft, unaware of the danger lurking beneath the surface. As Ethan was being dragged toward the security control room, panic rising in his chest, he could feel the weight of the situation closing in on him. The security officers weren't listening, their grip tightening on his arms, and his mind raced for any way to make them understand. Just as they reached the door to the control room, the businessman, who had been quietly watching the scene unfold, suddenly stood up and called out to the security personnel. "Hold on a moment," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. The officers stopped, confused, and looked back at him. "What's going on here?" the businessman asked, his gaze shifting from the security officers to Ethan, who was struggling to break free. The officers hesitated before answering, one of them speaking up. "There's a boy causing trouble, sir. He's been warning us that the plane is unsafe. He says it's dangerous to fly, but we didn't take him seriously," the officer explained. The businessman's eyes narrowed, sensing that something wasn't right. At first, he had dismissed Ethan's warnings as nothing more than the ramblings of a scared kid, but now something about the situation didn't sit right with him. "Get a technician to check the plane," the businessman ordered. "Now." Minutes later, the technician reported back with grim news. The plane's takeoff tire had been tampered with, deliberately damaged. It was a serious fault, one that could have led to a catastrophic accident if not addressed. The businessman's heart sank. Ethan's warning was true all along. But by the time the news came in, Ethan was no longer at the airport. He had left shortly after. Realizing the mistake, the businessman rushed to find Ethan. The young boy, who had been accused of causing trouble, had actually saved them all. The businessman now understood the gravity of the situation. He needed to know more about this boy who had risked everything to stop a disaster. He knew that Ethan's actions, though misunderstood, had changed the course of everything. The next day, Ethan woke up to a world that felt slightly off. He couldn't shake the memory of the man tampering with the jet, nor could he forget the dread that had settled in his chest as he watched him. Had he been right? Had he stopped a disaster before it could happen? The thought gnawed at him, keeping him restless as he went about his usual chores around the apartment. His mother had gone off to work early, leaving him with a day of solitude and quiet. Just as Ethan was sitting down to eat a makeshift breakfast, there came a knock at the door. A sharp, quick knock, too firm to be a neighbor, but not so urgent as to be a delivery. Ethan's stomach twisted in anticipation as he wiped his hands on his jeans and made his way to the door. When he opened it, standing in the hallway was a man in a sharply tailored suit, his posture confident but relaxed. He had a strong, almost regal presence, his salt and pepper hair combed neatly, his shoes polished to a gleaming shine. The man was tall, with an air of importance that immediately put Ethan on edge. He had the look of someone who didn't visit places like this unless he had to. "Good morning," the man said in a voice that was both smooth and authoritative. "You must be Ethan." Ethan blinked, unsure of how to respond. How did this man know his name? His heart started to race, but he held his composure. "Yeah, that's me," Ethan said, his voice a little rougher than he intended. "Can I help you?" The man smiled softly, as though he found some amusement in the question. "My name is Michael Caldwell. I'm a businessman, and I think we have something important to discuss." Ethan furrowed his brow, confused. "I don't know you," he replied cautiously. "About what?" Caldwell's smile faded, and his gaze turned more serious. "I believe you're the one who tried to warn me yesterday. About the airplane." Ethan's stomach twisted. How did this man know about that? He tried to push away the unease creeping up his spine. "How do you know about that?" Ethan asked, his voice low. "I was there," Caldwell said, his tone softening slightly. "I was about to board the plane when you started shouting. At first, I thought you were just a scared kid, but then I realized you were telling the truth. I had my technicians check, and sure enough, the tire was sabotaged. Could have caused a catastrophic accident if you hadn't acted. I'm here to thank you. Not many would have the courage to act as decisively as you did yesterday. That was extraordinary." Ethan didn't know what to say. He didn't even know if he should trust this man. After all, anyone could say they had been there. Anyone could claim to have been the one involved. But then Mr. Caldwell pulled a small, sleek business card from his jacket pocket and handed it to Ethan. "I'm sure you've got questions, and you should. But I believe you, Ethan," he said, his eyes locking with Ethan's. "You have a keen eye. More importantly, you have the guts to act on what you see. I want to help you." Ethan stared at the card, his fingers trembling slightly as he turned it over. The name, Michael Caldwell, was printed on the front in bold, elegant font, along with a phone number and an email address. Beneath the name, there was a small logo, a stylized jet with sleek lines, symbolizing some sort of high-end aviation business. The words beneath it read, Caldwell Aviation Solutions. Ethan didn't know what to say. His mind was reeling, trying to process the events of the previous day and the man standing before him now. Was this some kind of scam? Was Mr. Caldwell truly who he said he was? And more importantly, why would someone like him be interested in a kid like Ethan? "I know this seems strange," Caldwell continued, sensing the hesitation in Ethan's eyes. "But I've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't add up. You spotted a problem that no one else did. That's rare, and it's something I respect. You could have just walked away, but you didn't." Ethan's grip on the card tightened. The doubt was still there, but something about Caldwell's presence, the calm confidence in his voice, made him want to believe. "Why me?" Ethan finally asked, "Why are you here?" "I mean, I'm just, I'm just a kid working at an airport." Mr. Caldwell took a step closer, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "Because, Ethan, there's more to this than you know. More than you could ever imagine. And I think you might be the only one who can help me fix it." Before Ethan could respond, Caldwell handed him an envelope. "Take this. Call me when you've had time to think. Don't tell anyone about this, yet. Just know that things are about to change for you, and for your mom." Ethan looked down at the envelope, its weight heavy in his hand. He hadn't realized until that moment how desperately he wanted things to change, how desperately he needed a way out. As Caldwell turned to leave, he paused. "Oh, and Ethan," he added with a faint smile, "I know things haven't been easy for you. But trust me when I say, this is just the beginning. There's more in store for you than you ever thought possible." Ethan stood in the doorway, his heart racing. As Mr. Caldwell walked away, he slowly closed the door behind him. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, disbelief, and, just beneath it all, something else. Hope. Ethan sat down at the small kitchen table, the business card and envelope lying in front of him. His hands trembled slightly as he stared at them. He could barely wrap his mind around what had just happened. The man in the suit, this millionaire businessman, had come to him, believing in him, offering something that seemed too good to be true. His mom wasn't due home for a few more hours, and Ethan knew he needed to talk to her before he made any decisions. But as the minutes ticked by, he felt a glimmer of hope that he hadn't felt in years. Maybe, just maybe, this was the chance he'd been waiting for. When his mom arrived, Ethan wasted no time. He pulled the business card and envelope out of his pocket and handed them to her. "Mom," he said, his voice a little shaky but filled with excitement, "you're not going to believe this." She looked at the card, then at him, her expression softening. "Ethan, what is this?" "I met him yesterday," Ethan explained quickly. "Mr. Caldwell. He's the guy from the airport, the one I tried to warn. He wants to help us. He said things are going to change. He believes in me." His mom stared at the card, her eyes wide in disbelief. "Is this real?" she asked, her voice filled with both hope and skepticism. Ethan nodded, his heart pounding. "It is, Mom. I promise. We're going to be okay. Everything's going to change. I can feel it." His mother took a deep breath, looking down at the card, then back up at Ethan. "I don't know, Ethan. It sounds too good to be true." "I know," Ethan said, his voice filled with determination. "But I feel it. Things are finally going to get better. I can't explain it, but I know it. This is our chance." His mother hugged him tightly, the weight of everything they had endured beginning to lift, just a little. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed it too. The days that followed felt like a dream, one that Ethan wasn't quite sure he was ready to wake up from. The meeting with Mr. Caldwell had been surreal. The businessman's calm demeanor, the way he had listened so intently to Ethan's story, and the assurance that things were about to change. Everything seemed too good to be true. But the business card, pressed into his hand with a firm but friendly grip, was proof that this wasn't just some figment of his imagination. "Call me when you're ready," Mr. Caldwell had said with a smile before he left. "I'll be waiting." Now, sitting at the small kitchen table, Ethan looked at the card again. The black ink of Mr. Caldwell's name seemed to stand out on the crisp white paper, a stark contrast to the old, chipped countertops of their apartment. Ethan had always felt the weight of the world pressing down on him, his family just barely scraping by. But for the first time in a long time, something felt different. He wasn't just going through the motions anymore. He was on the brink of something bigger. Across from him, his mother sat quietly, her brow furrowed in thought. She hadn't said much since the business card had appeared in their lives, but Ethan could see the glimmer of hope in her eyes, the same spark that had been absent for so long. She had always been the rock, the one who carried the burden of their survival, but now, Ethan could sense a shift. There was something new between them now, a feeling of possibility. "Ethan," his mother said softly, breaking the silence, "do you really think this could work? I mean, everything's always been so hard." Her voice wavered slightly as she spoke, and Ethan saw the vulnerability in her eyes. He knew she was afraid of getting her hopes up only to be let down again. But this time felt different. "Yeah, Mom," Ethan said, his voice steady. "I really do. Mr. Caldwell said he could help. This isn't just some random offer, Mom. This is real." His mother nodded slowly, as if processing the idea. "You've worked so hard for us, Ethan. I've seen it. I've always seen it. But it's never been enough, has it?" Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tightening at the thought. She was right. He'd spent so many years just trying to keep them afloat, trying to make enough money to pay the rent, buy groceries, and keep the lights on. Every day had felt like a struggle, every week just another grind to survive. But now, sitting at this table, with the promise of something more on the horizon, it was like a weight was slowly lifting from his chest. He didn't have to be stuck anymore. They didn't have to be stuck. "I know it's been tough, but Mom," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination, "I think this is it. This could change everything." She looked at him, really looked at him, as if seeing him in a new light. For the first time, there was no doubt in her eyes. Only hope. The weight of the years spent struggling was still there, but now there was a glimmer. A hope that things could be different. They could have a future. The moment lingered in the air, heavy with the possibility of what could come next. Ethan had never known what it felt like to wake up with a sense of purpose, but this morning was different. For the first time in a long while, there was a lightness in his chest as he got out of bed. The apartment, though small and cramped, felt less suffocating now. He could breathe more easily, knowing that things were changing. He had a chance. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was actively working towards something better. His mind replayed the conversation with Mr. Caldwell. The businessman had offered him more than just a job. He had offered a way out. Ethan had never imagined that he would find himself on the path to something bigger than the monotonous grind of his day-to-day life. The opportunity Mr. Caldwell had given him to work at the aviation hangar felt like a lifeline, and Ethan was determined to seize it. After a quick breakfast, Ethan grabbed his jacket and stepped out the door, the cool morning air hitting him in the face like a reminder of how much was at stake. The hangar wasn't far, just a short walk from his apartment. He had made the decision to show up early today, eager to prove that he was ready to learn, to work hard, and to make the most of this opportunity. The days of scraping by felt distant now, like they belonged to someone else. Today, he was starting something new. As he approached the hangar, the familiar clanging of tools and the hum of the machines greeted him. He had been here before, but now everything felt different. There was purpose in every sound, every movement. Inside, the air smelled of oil and metal, and the buzz of activity felt energizing rather than overwhelming. This wasn't just a place to make ends meet. This was a place where he could build something real. "Hey, Ethan," Steve called out as he approached. Steve was the lead mechanic at the hangar and had quickly become a mentor to Ethan. The older man had noticed his determination from the very first day and had offered him guidance, teaching him the ropes of the aviation world. Steve was gruff, but he had a way of making Ethan feel capable, like he belonged here. Steve wiped his hands on a rag as he walked over to Ethan. "You ready to get to work?" Ethan nodded, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Yeah, I'm ready. What do you need me to do today?" "Come on," Steve said with a grin. "Let's get you started on something real." The rest of the morning flew by in a blur of activity. Steve showed Ethan how to properly inspect the aircraft, how to check the engines and landing gear for potential issues. Each task was a challenge, but one that Ethan felt driven to tackle. As he learned the mechanics of the job, he couldn't help but feel a growing sense of pride. The work was hard, much harder than anything he had done before, but it was rewarding in ways he couldn't explain. Each time he successfully completed a task, each time he gained a new skill, it felt like a small victory. Steve watched Ethan closely, nodding in approval as the young man worked. "You're picking this up fast," Steve said after Ethan successfully completed his first full inspection on one of the planes. "I think you've got a real knack for this, kid." Ethan felt a surge of pride at Steve's words. He had always struggled with self-doubt, always felt like he was too small, too insignificant to matter. But here, in the hangar, things were different. He was learning. He was growing. And, for the first time in his life, he felt like he was doing something that mattered. "You're doing great," Steve continued. "Keep this up, and you'll be running this place one day." His voice was rough, but there was genuine warmth behind it. Ethan couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to him like that, like he had potential, like he had worth. As the day went on, Ethan's confidence grew. He spent the afternoon working alongside Steve and the rest of the team, learning more about aircraft maintenance than he had ever thought possible. He didn't just feel like a kid anymore, tagging along in the background. He felt like a part of something bigger, something that was moving forward. By the time the sun began to set, Ethan was covered in grease and grime, his muscles sore from the physical labor. But for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep, satisfying sense of accomplishment. He had worked hard, and it had paid off. The satisfaction of a job well done was something he had never truly experienced before, and it felt good, better than anything he had imagined. This wasn't just a job. This was the beginning of something real. As Ethan cleaned up, Steve clapped him on the back. "You did good today, kid," he said with a proud smile. "You've got a good head on your shoulders. Keep at it, and you'll go far." Ethan's chest swelled with pride at Steve's words. No one had ever spoken to him like that before, not in a way that made him believe he could actually achieve something. And as he walked toward the door of the hangar, ready to head home, he couldn't help but feel that this was the start of something big. A new chapter, a new life. The evening air hit him as he stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing against his face. The sky was painted in shades of purple and orange, the setting sun casting long shadows over the tarmac. Ethan stopped for a moment, taking it all in. This was it. This was his chance. For the first time in his life, Ethan felt like he had something to work toward, a future that was no longer out of reach. He didn't know exactly where it would lead, but he was ready to follow it, to work for it. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning. Tomorrow would be another day of hard work. But for the first time, Ethan wasn't afraid. He was ready. Ethan's next day at the aviation hangar was everything he had imagined, and more. As he stepped through the wide metal doors, the smell of jet fuel and grease hit him like a wave. He could hear the hum of engines, the clinking of tools, and the steady rhythm of workers focused on their tasks. The space was vast, with rows of aircraft lined up in neat formations, each one polished and gleaming, ready to take flight at a moment's notice. Ethan felt the weight of the place, the intensity of the work, the responsibility that came with it. But instead of being overwhelmed, he felt exhilarated. This was where he belonged. Steve, the mentor who had been so kind to him the day before, greeted him with a nod. "You ready to learn?" Steve's voice was firm, but not unkind. There was a confidence in him that Ethan admired. Steve had been working at the hangar for years, and the way he moved, the way he spoke, made Ethan believe that Steve had seen it all. "Yeah, I'm ready," Ethan replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew this was a crucial moment. This was his shot, and he wasn't about to waste it. The first few hours were a blur of information. Steve introduced him to the basics, the tools, the machines, the protocols. It was a world Ethan had never known. Everything from checking the hydraulic systems to adjusting the weight distribution of the planes. There were safety measures to follow, procedures to memorize, and an unspoken expectation to keep up with the fast pace of the work. At first, Ethan struggled to keep up. The machines were larger than anything he had worked with, the tools more specialized than the basic wrenches and screwdrivers he was used to. There was a constant sense of urgency in the air as workers moved quickly and efficiently. But Steve was patient, always there to offer guidance when Ethan got lost in the complexity of the tasks. "You're doing good, kid," Steve said as he showed Ethan how to tighten a bolt on a plane's wing. "You just gotta keep your head on straight and take it one step at a time." Ethan nodded, his brow furrowed in concentration. It wasn't easy, but every task, no matter how small, felt like a victory. Each time he tightened a bolt, adjusted a piece of equipment, or helped a fellow worker with a task, he felt a little bit closer to understanding the language of this place. It was hard work, but it wasn't just hard for the sake of it. Everything had a purpose. Everything mattered. By midday, Ethan's hands were sore from the constant use of tools, and his shirt was soaked with sweat. He'd learned how to inspect an engine, how to refuel the planes, and how to check for any mechanical issues that could cause trouble in the air. Each task had its own rhythm, its own flow, and the more Ethan worked, the more comfortable he became with the routine. Around sunset, Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a deep breath, his muscles aching from the day's labor. He was exhausted, but there was an exhilaration in his chest that he had never experienced before. This wasn't just a job, it was a purpose. He had spent so long stuck in survival mode, trying to make ends meet, that he had forgotten what it felt like to feel truly alive. Today, he remembered. As the workers began to wrap up their shifts, Steve walked over to him, wiping his own hands with a rag. Ethan was still catching his breath, but he could tell Steve had been watching him throughout the day. The older man looked at him with a mix of approval and something deeper. Recognition? Maybe. "You did good today, Ethan," Steve said, clapping him on the shoulder. "I've seen a lot of guys come through here, but you've got something. You've got the right mindset." Ethan felt a surge of pride at Steve's words. He had worked hard all day, pushed through moments of frustration, and kept going even when he felt like he might drop from exhaustion. But hearing Steve's praise made it all worth it. It was the kind of recognition that meant more than just a pat on the back. It was a sign that he was on the right track. "You've got potential," Steve continued, his tone softening. "I can see it. You've got a knack for this work. Don't be afraid to push yourself. If you keep at it, you could go far. And if you're serious about it, I've got a few opportunities coming up, chances to get more hands-on work, maybe even some training to move up the ladder." Ethan's heart raced at the thought. This was it, the moment he had been working toward. More than just scraping by, more than just surviving. This was his chance to build something, to really change his life. It wasn't going to be easy. He knew that. But if Steve believed in him, maybe he had a shot at something greater. "Thanks, Steve," Ethan said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I won't let you down." Steve smiled and nodded. "I don't think you will, kid. Just keep doing what you're doing." As Ethan gathered his things and left the hangar that evening, the cool night air felt like a breath of fresh air. The exhaustion weighed on him, but there was a lightness in his step. He was no longer stuck in the mundane grind of his old life. The future was no longer a distant hope. It was right in front of him, and it was full of possibilities. The days that followed felt like a blur of motion and progress. Ethan was back at the hangar each day, his routine growing more familiar with each passing hour. Steve had made it clear from the beginning that the road to becoming skilled in this trade wouldn't be easy, but it was one that was worth taking. Ethan could see the hard work paying off already. His hands were no longer clumsy when he held the tools. His mind wasn't racing to remember the next step in a task. He had started to find a rhythm in the chaos of the hangar, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly building something for himself. Steve had become more than just a mentor. He was a guide, a steady force that Ethan could rely on. Someone who had been through the grind and was now pulling Ethan into the same world of possibility. Every time Ethan completed a task, Steve would give him a nod of approval, sometimes a word of praise. Other times, he would push him further, challenging him to do it faster, more efficiently. But always, there was a quiet confidence in Steve's demeanor, as if he knew Ethan had it in him all along. "You've got the right instincts, kid," Steve would say when Ethan managed to fix something that had once seemed impossible. "You're picking this up quicker than I thought." Those words fueled Ethan's desire to keep going. He had always felt like an outsider, like he was always one step behind. But now, for the first time, he could see a future where he wasn't just catching up. He was actually moving forward. That afternoon, as the sun began to set and the hangar grew quieter, Steve called Ethan over to his side. The planes were lined up in the distance, their engines off for the night, and the last bits of sunlight bathed the entire hangar in an orange glow. "Hey, Ethan," Steve said, his voice carrying a weight that made Ethan pause. "I've been thinking about you. You've got a lot of potential. You've been showing up every day, putting in the work, and that's something I respect. But you need to know this. It's not just about being good at fixing planes. It's about commitment. And you've got it. Keep coming back, and I'll make sure you learn everything you need to get where you want to go." Ethan stood there for a moment, taking in Steve's words. The older man's eyes were steady, his voice serious but encouraging. For so long, Ethan had felt like there was no one in his corner, no one who truly believed in him. But now, standing here at the hangar with Steve, he realized that someone did. Someone saw potential in him, and it wasn't just his mother anymore. "I'm not gonna let you down," Ethan said, his voice firm and sure. "I'll keep coming back. I promise." Steve clapped him on the shoulder, a rare smile spreading across his face. "That's what I like to hear." As the last rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan felt something stir inside him, a sense of pride, of purpose that he hadn't known before. The work was hard. The days were long. But there was a clear path ahead, one that he was determined to follow. When he stepped outside the hangar later that evening, the cool air hit him like a breath of fresh air, cleansing him of the heat and tension from a long day of work. The sky above was a deepening shade of blue, and the stars had begun to appear, flickering faintly like the possibilities that had suddenly opened up before him. Ethan took a deep breath and looked around at the vast, empty runway. For the first time in his life, he felt like he was standing on the edge of something real, something that could change everything for him and his family. He wasn't just scraping by anymore. He wasn't stuck in the cycle of survival. He was building something. As the breeze ruffled his hair, Ethan realized that his future was no longer uncertain. It wasn't set in stone, of course. There would be challenges ahead, more hard work to do. But now, with every task he completed, with every lesson he learned, he was getting closer to something bigger than just surviving. He was building a life, one that he could be proud of, one that offered not just hope but a real future. And he was going to make sure he never stopped moving forward. As he walked away from the hangar, heading home to his mother, the sense of possibility was overwhelming. He wasn't sure what would come next, but he knew one thing for certain. He had a future. He had purpose. And that was worth everything. Tomorrow would be another step on the road ahead. And Ethan was ready to take it. That evening, Ethan and his mother sat down to dinner together. It wasn't much, a simple meal of spaghetti and salad, but it felt like the best dinner they'd had in years. The kitchen, small and cozy as it was, had a warmth to it that neither of them had felt in a long time. The air smelled of tomato sauce and garlic, the kind of scent that made everything feel right for a moment, even if just for a moment. Ethan watched his mother as she served the food, her movements slow but graceful. She had always been a hard worker, never complaining. But now there was something different in the way she carried herself. She had always been strong for him, but tonight, Ethan could see that she was finally allowing herself to dream, just a little. The old doubts and fears were still there, of course, but they were fading, replaced by something new, something better. "This feels different," his mother said quietly, sitting down at the table. She looked at the meal in front of her, but her eyes kept drifting back to Ethan. "You've made a difference, Ethan. I'm proud of you." Ethan smiled at her, feeling the lump in his throat tighten. His mother had always been the one to hold everything together, to make the impossible possible. But now, for the first time, he could feel her leaning on him, trusting him, believing in the future they could build together. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom," Ethan said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "Everything I do for you." His mother reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "We've both done this together, Ethan. And now we're going to have a future. No more struggling. No more worrying about tomorrow." They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds in the room the clink of forks against plates. For once, the world outside seemed far away, as if the two of them were the only ones who mattered in that moment. Later that evening, after dinner was cleaned up and the night settled in, Ethan sat in the small living room, his mind still buzzing with thoughts of the future. He looked around the room, at the old furniture and the peeling wallpaper, and for the first time, he didn't see just what they had. He saw what they could have, a future that wasn't defined by struggle, but by the possibility of something more. And as he looked at his mom, sitting beside him with a soft smile on her face, he realized that this was just the beginning. The life they had known, the life of survival, was finally coming to an end. They had hope now. They had a chance. And together, they were going to take it. The change in Ethan's life was almost unrecognizable. A few months ago, he had been stuck, caught in the cycle of survival, struggling to make ends meet, to get through each day. Now, each morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose that he had never experienced before. Gone were the days of uncertainty, of scraping by, of wondering if things would ever get better. He had found a direction, a path that was both challenging and rewarding, one that was slowly but surely shaping him into someone he had never imagined he could become. The hangar had become more than just a place to work. It had become his sanctuary. It was where he learned and grew, where his days were filled with tasks that made him feel alive, not just occupied. Every new skill he acquired, every task he completed, brought him closer to the person he wanted to be. Ethan was learning the ropes of aviation, how to maintain the aircrafts, understand the mechanics behind the engines, and even the delicate art of inspecting the safety systems. At first, the work had been daunting. The jargon, the technical intricacies, and the complex systems of the planes had been foreign to him. But now, every detail felt like a small victory. The grime on his hands no longer symbolized the fight to survive. It was the residue of hard work and dedication, of passion for a craft that was slowly becoming his life. There was something deeply satisfying about the work. The feeling of taking something complex, an engine, a landing gear, a fuel system, and making it work again was unlike anything he had ever felt. With each task, he gained not only a deeper understanding of the machines, but also a sense of pride that had been absent from his life for as long as he could remember. "That's it, you're getting it," Steve said one day, as Ethan finished tightening a bolt on an engine. His words were simple, but they resonated with Ethan. Steve had been a constant source of encouragement, always pushing him to reach higher. And Ethan was rising to the challenge. What had once seemed impossible, fixing a jet engine, performing a system check, was now within his grasp. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living. The sense of accomplishment that came from each task was new to him. Ethan had always done what he had to do to get by, but now there was a new energy in his life. He was learning skills that would take him places. He wasn't stuck anymore. The future that had once seemed so uncertain now stretched before him like an open road, full of possibilities. Ethan found himself waking up early each morning, eager to get to the hangar. He couldn't wait to dive into the work that awaited him. And it wasn't just the work that drew him in. It was the people he was surrounded by. The other technicians, the engineers, the pilots, all of them shared a common goal: to make sure each plane was in perfect condition before it took off. There was a camaraderie in the hangar that he hadn't known before. It was a place of purpose, a place where each person had a role to play, and where teamwork was the key to success. As the days passed, Ethan's transformation became more evident. His confidence grew. He was no longer the unsure, scrappy teenager who had been trying to survive in the rough world outside the hangar. He was becoming someone who had a future, someone with skills that would allow him to succeed in life, not just scrape by. And then there was the money. Ethan had never seen a paycheck like the one he got from the hangar. It wasn't much at first, but it was more than he had ever made. More than that, it was a sign that his hard work was paying off, that he was valued, that he had something to contribute. With each paycheck, the weight of his past life seemed to lift a little more. The fear of being unable to pay rent, the constant worry about his family's survival, all of it felt distant now. He was no longer trapped in that cycle. On weekends, Ethan would sometimes take his mom out for small treats: lunch at a restaurant, a movie, a simple shopping trip. He could tell she was proud of him. She'd give him these quiet smiles when he told her about his day, her eyes soft with emotion. Ethan had been her rock for so long, but now he could be her support in a different way. He was becoming the person she had always hoped he would be, the person he had always hoped to be, but hadn't known how to become. One late afternoon, after a long day of work, Ethan stood outside the hangar, looking at the sky as the sun began to set. The cool evening air brushed against his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment, letting it wash over him. He could hear the faint hum of the planes being prepped for their evening flights, the voices of the other workers, the clatter of tools being put away. It was peaceful in a way that he hadn't known before. For the first time, Ethan realized that he wasn't just passing through life. He wasn't just trying to survive. He was shaping his future. And the best part? He was doing it on his own terms. The road ahead of him stretched out in front of him, wide and full of promise. There were challenges ahead, of course. There always would be. But Ethan knew that with each step forward, he was moving closer to something bigger, something meaningful. This was only the beginning. And as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above the hangar, Ethan couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. For the first time in his life, he felt like he had a future worth looking forward to. The boxes were stacked high in the small living room, and the air smelled of packing tape and cardboard. Ethan's mother moved around the apartment with a quiet energy, carefully wrapping dishes and sorting through their belongings. It had been a long process, one that had involved a lot of organizing and preparing, but today was the day. Today, they were moving. The apartment they had called home for so long would soon be a distant memory. Their new place was bigger, brighter, and in a safer neighborhood. It felt like a new beginning, a symbol of everything that had changed in their lives. Ethan couldn't help but feel a mixture of excitement and disbelief. The idea of moving had always felt like an impossible dream. There had been times when he and his mom had barely been able to scrape together enough money to pay rent, and now, here they were, packing up to leave for a better place, one they could actually afford without the constant fear of eviction hanging over their heads. As he helped his mother load the last few boxes into the back of the old truck, Ethan paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the apartment building they were leaving behind. It had been a tough place to live. The walls were thin, the plumbing unreliable, and the heat in the winter barely enough to keep them warm. But it had been home, and despite its flaws, it had been where he and his mom had spent some of their most challenging and, in a way, defining years. "All right, that's the last of it," Ethan said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. His muscles ached from all the lifting and carrying, but there was a strange sense of satisfaction in his exhaustion. For the first time in a long time, the physical work felt worth it. His mother smiled at him from the door, her eyes bright with pride. "You've really come a long way, haven't you, Ethan?" she said softly. Her voice was filled with a tenderness that made his chest tighten. It wasn't just the move that had changed their lives. It was everything that had led up to this moment. Ethan smiled back, feeling a warmth spread through him. "Yeah, I guess I have." As they drove to their new apartment, the city outside the truck window seemed to shift. The streets looked cleaner, the buildings taller and newer. They were no longer confined to the cramped, overcrowded part of town where everything felt like a struggle. Their new neighborhood was quieter, with tree-lined streets and houses that looked well kept. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt a sense of possibility settle over him. This move wasn't just about a new apartment, it was about a new life. A life that was no longer defined by the constant weight of worry and survival. When they arrived, the first thing that struck Ethan was how much space there was. The apartment, while not extravagant, was much larger than their old place. The living room was bright and open, with large windows that let in the sunlight, and the kitchen had enough room for his mom to cook without feeling cramped. There was a small balcony overlooking a park, a place where they could sit and watch the world go by, and Ethan felt a quiet sense of relief wash over him. This was what he had been working toward. This was the future he had been fighting for. His mom, who had been quiet during the drive, finally spoke as they stood in the doorway of their new home. "Ethan, I don't know what to say," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I never thought we'd get here. I never thought we'd have a place like this. You've made all the difference." Ethan could see the tears in her eyes, but he could also see the pride. She was proud of him, of how far they had come, and he could feel that pride filling the room, making it feel like home before they had even unpacked. It was the first time in a long time that he could feel the weight of his hard work not just as a burden, but as something to be proud of. As the evening wore on, they unpacked the last of the boxes, arranging furniture and placing photographs on the walls. It was all small, simple things, but they carried so much meaning. As they worked together, Ethan couldn't help but reflect on how much his life had changed in such a short amount of time. It felt like everything had turned upside down after that day at the airport, after he had made the decision to warn that man in the suit. That moment had been the beginning of everything. He thought back to the first time he'd seen the jets, the way he'd felt a twinge of longing as he watched the passengers board. He had been so far from that world. But now, He was a part of it. Now, he had a job at the hangar, learning the skills that would set him on a path to something bigger. He had a future that was his to shape, and it all started with one decision. One moment when he had chosen to act, to speak up, even when it seemed like no one would listen. As he stood by the window, looking out at the quiet streets, Ethan couldn't help but smile. He knew there was still a long way to go, but for the first time in his life, he felt like he was on the right track. He was no longer just trying to survive. He was building something. He was shaping a life he could be proud of, a future that was bright with possibility. "Mom, this is just the beginning," Ethan said, his voice full of quiet confidence. His mom looked at him, her face softened by a smile that reflected both love and hope. "I know, Ethan. I know." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed it too. The road ahead was uncertain, but with each step, he was creating a future that was no longer defined by struggle, but by hope, hard work, and the promise of a better life. A few days after the move, their new apartment finally felt like home. It wasn't the biggest place. They had to make do with what they could afford, but it was theirs. For the first time in a long time, the weight of uncertainty had been lifted off their shoulders. They had a place to live without the constant fear of eviction. They had security, a solid foundation, and, perhaps most importantly, they had hope. Ethan stood in the living room, the soft hum of the city outside filling the space as he gazed out the window. The streets here were quieter, the buildings newer, and the air felt fresher than in their old apartment. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. It was the life he had dreamed of, the one he had once thought was out of reach. A life where he and his mother no longer had to fight every day just to survive. Instead, they could build something, grow, and live. His mother walked into the room, her tired eyes softening as she took in their new home. She had spent so many years worrying, so many years trying to keep their heads above water. But now, there was a lightness in her steps that Ethan hadn't seen before. It was as if the years of struggle had finally caught up with her, and now she could breathe. "Ethan," she said quietly, walking over to him, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. You've been so strong, so determined, and look at where we are now. I don't think I could have gotten through all of this without you." Ethan felt his heart swell with emotion. He had always known how much his mom had sacrificed for him, how hard she had worked to make sure they had enough, even when it didn't feel like enough. But hearing her say it out loud, seeing the pride in her eyes, it meant more than words could express. "It wasn't just me, Mom," Ethan said, his voice thick with gratitude. "We did this together. I couldn't have done it without you either." His mother smiled, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Still, I've watched you grow so much. You're not just surviving anymore. You're thriving. You're building a future for us, one that's not based on getting by, but on something better, something real. And I can see it, Ethan. I can see the person you're becoming. You've shown bravery, strength, and a level of determination that I admire more than anything." Ethan turned to look out the window again, a small smile tugging at his lips. His mind wandered back to the day he had first decided to take action at the airport, to the moment he had seen the danger that no one else could see and had chosen to act. That day had changed everything. It was the beginning of something much bigger than he had ever imagined. It was a reminder that, sometimes, one moment, one decision, could set a new course for your entire life. Looking back, he realized how much he had grown. The young man who had stood at the airport, terrified but determined to warn a stranger about a sabotage, was now someone who understood the true meaning of hard work, the power of persistence, and the importance of believing in yourself when everything around you seems impossible. He had gone from scraping by, from struggling with no clear path ahead, to now standing on the edge of a future that was full of promise. It wasn't just the move that had changed things. It was the journey he had taken, the lessons he had learned along the way. He had found a new sense of purpose in the hangar, working with his hands, learning the craft of aviation. And he had found something even more valuable, a belief in his own potential. He was no longer afraid of the future. He was ready to meet it head-on. As they settled into their new life, the world seemed to open up before them. There was a freedom that came with the end of their financial struggles, and it gave them both the space to dream bigger, to think about what they could truly achieve. For the first time, Ethan and his mother weren't just surviving. They were living, and they were beginning to believe that anything was possible. Ethan's thoughts turned to the future as he sat down with his mother for dinner that evening, the first meal they'd shared in their new home. The table was modest, just the two of them, but there was a warmth in the room that wasn't there before. The meal, though simple, tasted better than anything he had ever eaten. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice steady but filled with excitement. "I don't know exactly where we're going, but I know it's going to be something great, something bigger than I ever thought was possible." His mother nodded, her eyes soft with love. "I believe in you, Ethan. I always have." And for the first time, Ethan believed in himself, too. This chapter of his life, the one that had started with so much uncertainty and struggle, had led him here, to a place of hope, growth, and endless possibilities. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges, setbacks, and moments of doubt. But with the strength he had found within himself, with the support of his mother, and with the opportunities that were now within his reach, he was ready for whatever came next. Ethan had learned that life didn't always go according to plan. Sometimes, the greatest moments of change came when you least expected them. But he had also learned that you could shape your own future, that even the darkest moments could be the start of something brighter. And as he looked ahead, he knew this was only the beginning. There was a future full of possibilities waiting for him, and he was ready to take it on, one step at a time. Ethan's journey from a struggling teenager to a young man with a bright future is a powerful reminder that no matter how dire a situation may seem, there is always a chance for change. The key is resilience, the ability to keep going when things are tough, to find strength in the face of adversity, and to take action when it matters most. It's about believing in yourself when the odds seem stacked against you, and understanding that every step forward, no matter how small, brings you closer to the future you want to create. The real lesson here is that your circumstances don't define your potential, your determination does. Thank you so much for sticking with us all the way through this story. Your time and attention mean the world. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you won't miss any of our future stories filled with inspiration and hope. See you in the next one.